Good afternoon. It is a great honor to have been asked to kick off this conference with my paper. And I use deliberately the verb kick off, as England plays Denmark and Spain faces Italy later on in the Euros. Just mentioned, with a study of the fundamental text that we are going to study, reflect, and speak about in these days. In the abstract, you can read what is so special about Israel. As soon as Israel arrives at Mount Sinai, God gives them an identity and a charter to live by. This paper will set Exodus 19:3-6 within the literary context, and after a close reading and analysis of its more important element, attempt to offer an interpretation and evaluate the influence in later biblical traditions. So what I intend to do is an introduction to the book of Exodus, to put our text in its context, to mention some literary features, some of the interpretation, and some of the reception history of this text within biblical studies. This is just to make sure that we understand what we are saying. I teach my students that in order to understand a biblical text, there are 4 different coordinates, I call them. One is the biblical text itself, in its beauty, its complexity, and variety. 2, how this biblical text relates to non-biblical tradition. 3, what we can call what archaeology enlightens us with. And finally, the work of reception history, how these texts have been received and passed on. On this paper today, I want to focus on both the biblical text and its reception. Just to say that the book of Numbers, of Shemot, is the second book of the Bible and recounts the exit of the Israelites from the land of Egypt and their arrival to Mount Sinai. Given the situation of the Jews, this event is the foundational experience of the people as a nation and the foundation of their faith. Coming out of Egypt made the Jews a nation. The Sinai experience changed them into a people, God's own people, dedicated to worshiping this God who had taken them out from slavery of Egypt to the promised land. So these 2 different traditions, the Exodus, the coming out, making Israel a nation, and the Sinai covenant, making them God's people, come together in our book. The structure, as you know, is quite simple. We can say there is a tripartite structure. In Egypt, we begin with the story, with the birth of Moses and everything that went on till Israel came out of Egypt. Then in the desert, with all the trials and tribulations. And the third part, which is what we are all about, Exodus. 1940. It is in this third part, the largest of the book, that has as its center the solemn event of God's covenant with his people and the theophany. Then God instructs people how to make the tent of meeting, as we have heard, how to furbish it and what to do there. The important category in our book is the one of journey. All around the structure of the book will have the itinerary formulas with a combination of verb to depart, to go, to pitch camp, in such a way that we can organize the rest of the Pentateuch like follows. From Egypt through the desert, Sinai, through the desert into Moab. Nice, simple structure. But even more theologically, and I think this is part of what concerns us, is what we can say, what is the dynamics that we have. The book of Exodus comes to answer the question, who do we serve? We go from being slaves, the verb abad in Hebrew, to the slavery or the service, which is liturgical service, the avodah. So God has taken a bunch of slaves that were serving Pharaoh and puts them towards the promised land, the freedom of its worship. Now, let's get into the text. Clear, and there we've got the pericope, chapter 19, 1-9, which I have translated rather literally for our own purposes. On the third day from the exit of Egypt, the sons of Israel, blah, blah, blah. Verse 3, and Moses went up to God, and the Lord called from the mountain, saying, thus you will say to the sons of Jacob, and you will recount to the sons of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and I raised you up on eagle's wings, and I have caused you to come to me. And now, if you really obey my voice and keep my commandments, and you will be for me a special possession from all the peoples, because the whole earth belongs to me, then you yourselves will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you will say to the sons of Israel. I'll explain why I translate certain things the way I translate them. Some of the literary features, so that we can... What is the genre, which is something that occupies us, exegetes? I've spent 3 days trying to define the genre of the book of the Apocalypse earlier this week, and we end up saying, boo. We don't know, but we like to do that. I mean, so exegesis. So it belongs to the great discourses of Adonai, the discourses that are given to the people, and if you think, usually never directly, but through the means of a prophet. And from this moment to the second book of Kings, God will use someone to pass on that message. Whereas at the beginning in Genesis and what have you was face to face. What are the limits of our text? We know that the narrative breaks abruptly in 19:1 by the phrase Bechodesh B'Shelishi, on the 3rd month, as Israel arrives to Mount Sinai. Verse 1 and 2 give us an introduction, providing the spatio-temporal coordinates of the episodes. And then Verse 3 acts as an introduction to the divine speech and is nicely framed by the reference to the sons of Israel, making a nice inclusio, a nice bracketing. So that's why we can say verses 4 to 6 form one unit. One of the most discussed part of this feature of this text, as you may know, is the conditional question. There are two possibilities. And if you really obey my voice and keep my commandments, then you will be for me a special possession from all the people, because the whole earth is mine. You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Or, as I prefer, if you really obey my voice and keep my commandments, and you will be for me a special possession from all the peoples, because all earth belongs to me, then is whether we put the apodosis at the beginning of verse 6 or the end of verse 5. As you may know, Hebrew does not have a way formally of saying where the apodosis begins. So, why there are different ways? I don't want to bore you with deep grammatical Hebrew questions. Happy to do it, but I've got my students for that. In verse 6, what I have translated as you yourselves, why do I do it in that way? Is because the pronoun, which is not necessary in Hebrew, is present in the Hebrew here. Why? Because it wants to reinforce, and most probably in comparison with other grammatical places, that the apodosis begins there. The condition to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation is listening to the word of God, obeying, and being the special possession. And we will see what that means in a second. So if Israel, paraphrasing, will surely heed the voice of God and keep his commandments and be a treasured possession, living as if they were valued for God, then they will fulfill their calling as a royal priesthood and a holy nation. That means that at the end, our verses, we could express them in this way. The main line of argument is you have seen what God has done for you. Then if you really obey, you yourselves will be for me. Because you have seen what I have done, because I have chosen you, you become these special people. That's my interpretation grammatically of what's going on. If you bear with me, I want to in order to understand more fully our text, there are 3 words or expressions we need to understand. One of them is the word segula. Segula is that special possession that God has with his people. There are instances in which the word segular refers to a costly, valued, personally gained property, normally reserved to the king's sole use and special purposes. As in Kohelet 2:8 or 1 Chronicles 29. In Deuteronomy, however, parallel text with a similar vocabulary to ours, there is an understanding that God has called Israel to be something different, to live out a different status. Adonai chose Israel to be his segula, showing to all the nations the worth that Israel has. And in Psalm 135, Israel is God's personal possession. He has acquired them, and this they have to live. How did they live this? By fleeing wickedness. Then perhaps the real crunch of the point is the expression Mamlechet Kohanim, kingdom of priests, priestly kingdom. What on earth does it mean? Because it's one of the things we like the most, a hapax legomenon, so I haven't got a clue. So, philologically, we could say it has two meanings. A priestly kingdom, as the actual adjective priestly does not exist in Hebrew, so by using an epexegetical genitive similar to Hebrew, to Greek and Latin, those modern languages. So a kingdom which has as its quality being priestly. As Hebrew, as I write there, does not have the adjective priestly, it uses the construct chain. And I could explain that to you later on. Or something that we need to say whether or not it is a subjective genitive. Similar to Latin or Greek, kingdom of priests means a kingdom governed by priests. Similar to the expressions in Jeremiah, in the beginning of the kingdom of the reign of Jehoiakim. Because of the interpretation of New Testament authors that we will go on to see in a moment or two, and from the time of Luther and others, the interpretation A has been favored, and I think it's right. Understanding Hebrew parallelism, the kingdom of priests and the holy people, is it a case of synonymous parallelism or what is called synthetic? The members are not strictly synonymous, but separate entities. Priestly kings form the totality with the people, together with them. God is promising a new status, not a new rule. What we are giving is not a new political class, because, I mean, in the good old historical critical methods, you put this in the time of Persian, when the high priesthood and the theocratical moments say, here you are. We've got the theological foundation of what we are doing. I don't think it's right. It could have been, but for our purposes, what we are doing is, what we are reflecting is what God has done for his people, the way in which he wants to rebuild his people. This is similar to what we hear in Isaiah 61 verse 6 that we read in our liturgy at the Christian Mass. But you shall be called priests of the Lord. They shall speak of you as ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, blah, 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 blah. This text is addressed to the community of a rebuilt Jerusalem, which will be served by foreigners while they will be priests of the Lord, because of the offerings of the nations would be enough for their survival. So already within the theology of Israel, there is this idea that Israel is different from the nations. And we see it also from our foundational text. The other interesting thing is the word berit, that everybody knows, means covenant. What covenant are we talking about? Because this is the first mention of the covenant in Exodus. In Deuteronomy, it is a synonym of the Ten Commandments. But here it introduces a new dimension into the relationship between God and his people. Remember that there is another wonderful inclusio, another wonderful bracketing with chapter 24, verse 7. All the words of Adonai and Berit appear also at the end of 24:7. We will say that there is the mention of the law is anything between 19 and 24. Thus, Ten Commandments, those expressions of the law of God. So, as a kind of summary of this part, if I may, Israel is God's own people dedicated to the service of God among the nations, as priests function in society. The qualities of the people after the action of God is to be understood as related to each other. Israel is God's own people dedicated to the service of God among the nations. I think that would be quite interesting, but I didn't have time to go into, would be a comparison between the people and Moses. The people are the priestly people. Moses is the intercessor. So it's something I'm sorry I didn't have enough time for that. Next paper could be that. However, if I've got 5 minutes, I want to move on to cross the Rubicon, to go to the New Testament. One of my professors and some of my students have heard me call it the tritocanonical books, New Testament. So there, as you know, there are three, you better than me know, there are 3 instances of this text in the New Testament. 1 Peter 2:9, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his own marvelous light. And then twice in the book of Revelation, one in the salutation, and he has made thus a kingdom of priests to his God and Father. To him the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And in the great vision of the Lamb, and you have made of them a kingdom of priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. As always, biblical New Testament authors put a cocktail of different traditions from the Old Testament. The Old Testament words of the elections are now transferred to the church. They are not a direct quotation, as we see, but this verse are an array of passages collected together with explanatory remarks. These quotations describe the dignity and status of the Christian community as chosen by God, redeemed through Jesus Christ, and formed into a living temple. Exodus 19 is put together, as you well know, with Isaiah 43:20. For I give water, Isaiah says, in the form for myself, that they might declare my praise. This is the Christian interpretation, which can be seen also in Revelation 1:6 and 5:10. The verse begins with a contrast, but you. As society rejects the gospel, Christians should see themselves as God's chosen people, used in parallel with the three terms of difference. Genos are the people having the same origin. Ethnos are the people who have similar customs, whereas Laos points to the body of people pursuing a common goal. In the Septuagint, Laos is the people of God, whereas ethnos, as we well know, are the foreign nations. As the qualities describes, Christians are people only through choice and sanctification, as referring to the end of times. They are a chosen people in the same way as the stone who was established through exaltation. They are a holy people because they belong to the one who redeemed them through the death of Jesus. It is a royal priesthood, but does not have a political role, as one might have said of Exodus. Their mission, the dimension is vertical. Christians are royals because they have taken into the kingdom or kingship of God. Finally, the mission of God's holy people of His church is to proclaim the great deeds of God, the power manifested in the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. Christians experience it as a transfer from darkness into light, which is wonderful because it is the miracle of deliverance from decay. Thank you.